Alright, what's going on everyone? So today we're back on Web Dev Daily to do another challenge video. Now if you're unaware of what Web Dev Daily is, it's a platform I created and released about a month ago that's designed to challenge your front-end skills by building out daily projects. So every day we release a new design, and the challenge is to convert this design into code using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript within our built-in IDE. And once you complete a challenge, it'll then be added to your profile, which can then be used as a portfolio to showcase all of your work. And as you can see, I went ahead and completed a few challenges here on the platform myself, and what happens when you select on one, it is going to show you the solution that that user wrote for that particular challenge. Alright, so let's get started on today's challenge, which is going to be the checkout modal. So to get started, once you are signed into the platform, you just want to click on Start Challenge, and this is going to take you to the editor. So on the left hand side we have the editor itself, which has the HTML, the CSS, and JavaScript, and we also have some basic settings that you can adjust, such as the theme, the minimap, and also the font size. So for the font size, I will go ahead and bump this up a little bit just to make it a little easier to see. And then on the right hand side, we have a preview of the code that is currently in the editor. And by default, whenever you start a new challenge, you're going to see this modal, which just has the basic objective and gives you a little bit more information about the challenge and some of the editor features. Now, one thing I do want to point out here really quickly is that when you start a new challenge by default, you will have a few libraries automatically imported for you. So you can see that within the head section within the HTML tab that we have Google Fonts being imported, and by default we're just using the Rubik's font family, and that's being set within the CSS. Then we have the Tailwind CDN to apply Tailwind. So if you do want to use Tailwind, you can just keep this script in here, or if you just want to use traditional CSS, you can remove that and then write all of your CSS within this tab here. And lastly, since icons are very common to use in these challenges, we have a library called Iconify, which is probably my favorite library for icons, installed here by default, and they're really easy to use. All you need to do is go to Iconify, grab the icon that you want, and they actually have a HTML web component you can just paste in here to add that icon to your challenge. Alright, so let's get started by removing the starting modal that we have. So inside of our editor, we can just collapse this entire div, we can select it, and then we can just remove that. So the first thing we'll want to do is toggle the challenge preview. Now to do this, we can either click on this button here in the bottom right hand corner to toggle this, or there's actually a keybind now you can use, which is Command X or Control X if you're on Windows, to do that a little bit easier while you're actually coding this out. Now, what I like to do when I start something like this or any type of project in general is just go over the design and kind of get an idea for the structure of how we're going to build this out. So what we have here, from what I can see, is a form that is going to be centered into the middle of the screen. Now, within this form, we have a few different sections, and we even have a few subsections. So we have our header, then we have this section for the billing cycle, if it's going to be monthly or yearly. And then we have this section here, which has all of, the information on the billing, and then our form inputs, which within this section, we have a few different subsections. And the reason why I like to break things down, or at least think about things in terms of sections, is because of spacing. So from looking at this design, what we're going to do is we're going to set the form to be a flex container, and then we're going to set the flex direction to be a column. Now, once we do that, we can use a property called gap to evenly set the spacings between each one of these flex children. So this H1 is going to be a flex child, this section right here will be a flex child, and then this section right here will also be a flex child. And from looking at this, we can see that, at least from my eye, the spacing between this first section and the second section is the same as the spacing between the second section and the third section. Okay, so now that we have a plan for how we want to structure this, let's begin to write our markup. So within the body, let's start off by creating a div, and this div is going to be like the container for this entire form, and we want this container to take up the full page. So to do this, we can use a class from Tailwind. So if I haven't mentioned this already, we are going to be using Tailwind to style this out. We can use a class called min-h screen, and what this does is it's going to set the height to be 100 VH, or the entire viewport. And to push all the contents to the center, we want to set the display to flex, and we want to use a couple classes, one called justify-center and then another one called items center, and this is going to push everything to the center as we have here inside of our design. And inside of this div, or our container, whatever you want to call it, we can then create our form. And we can leave the action blank for now. And as we mentioned, we want to add a few classes to our form. So first off, we want to set the display to flex, and then we want to set the flex direction to be a column. So we can do that with flex-col. And inside of this form, we can begin to create all the elements that we're going to need. So the first one's going to be our header. So we can just create an H1, and then this needs to say get unlimited access to everything. And for now, we're not going to worry about the styling. We're just going to work on the structure of everything. So we'll come back and we'll, handle all the styling and padding and all that stuff once we kind of get everything laid out. So beneath our header, we're going to have this section with these two inputs for the monthly billing cycle or the yearly. So we'll create a div, and then we'll just apply a couple classes to, get the structure of this built. So we want to have this be a flex container, and we're going to want it to be in a row. So we'll keep it at that. And then I think we can leave it at that. We'll come back and, add all the spacing and whatnot later. So within this, we're going to want to create a div for each one of these boxes. So we'll say another div, and this will have a class of flex as well. And then within here, we're going to have our input, and the type of this is going to be a radio. And I think we can just leave it as that for right now. And then we want to create another div to hold the actual information for what this input is representing. So we'll create a div, and this will also have the class of flex, and then we'll just create some text elements. So we can just probably use paragraph tags will be fine. We'll say monthly, and then beneath this, we can just copy this down. We can just say $7 a month. And since we're going to need two of these to save some time, we can just copy this entire snippet for this div with the class of flex. So we can copy this down, and then what we want to do is we want to change out the monthly. We'll say yearly, and then we also want to add a span tag within here, because as you can see, we have this little tag. So we can just add a span, and then we can say save $10. And we'll also want to change out the $7 for 50, and instead of saying month, this will say year. And if we save those changes and then we toggle off our preview, we should now see the content that we just went ahead and created. Alright, so let's go ahead and collapse this markup for our second section and begin to work on the third. So for this, we'll create another div, and this one will have a class of flex as well. But this one we want to have in a column, since everything's going to be, we don't want it to be in a row. So we're going to apply a class of flex-col, and then within here, we'll create I think we're going to want to create another div to store each one of these. So in this third section, we have a few subsections. So I see it as this being one, the actual form inputs, and then we have this bottom section. So we'll store the header information inside of another div. I don't believe we need to give it any sort of class. We can just have it, be used as a wrapper. So we'll provide an H2, and we'll say total billed $50. And beneath this header, we'll just create a paragraph tag, and this will be used to store this text right here. Now beneath this header, we'll want to create another div for the form inputs, and I believe this one we're going to want to provide a class of flex, and we honestly probably could provide a class of flex and then say flex column on this one, and then we could also provide a gap to add some spacing there. So we'll do the same thing. We'll say flex column. Now this may be unnecessary, but we can always come back and touch this up if we don't need it. So within here, we're going to have our first input, which we're going to want to contain inside of a div. And then inside of this div, we're going to have our label. And this will be for, we'll say credit number. And then we can just say card number in the label. And then beneath this label, we'll have our input. And the type can just be text. I believe we don't need to do any sort of fancy formatting for this. I think, that is good how it is. And then what we want to do is actually what we want to do is we also want to provide a placeholder and an ID for this input so that the label and input can sync with each other. So for the ID, we can just say credit number, and then they don't actually give us a placeholder value. So maybe we can just put in what they have there. So 1, 2, 3, 4 like this, and we can just, duplicate this a couple times. Now below this, we're going to want to create another container to store these two inputs side by side. So we'll say a div again, and then we'll provide a class of flex. And then I think we can just copy this markup we have for our inputs and then just, save some time and just paste those in. So let's see. So for the label, this will be for the expiration date. And we can copy this value and paste it inside of the ID for this input. And then also we'll just say expiration date like this and just capital. We can keep that one lowercase, and we'll just capitalize this. And for the type, we can just change this to be a date. And then for the placeholder, we can just put what they have inside of the design. We can just do mm/YY. And again, since these are going to be practically the same, we can just duplicate this down like this, and we can just change out the for and ID. So this one's going to be for the security code. And we'll copy this value here, and we'll paste it inside of the ID, and then we'll also update the label. And we'll also want to update the type. Now, I believe we could use number for this, but I think to keep things actually simple in terms of styling, we can just use the type of text. And then for the placeholder, we'll just change this to 123. So the final bit of markup we'll need is this little disclaimer text and then also the button. So what we'll do for this is let's collapse some of this markup to make things a little bit easier to see what's going on. So we'll want to create another section. And again, I don't think we need to, we probably can just say class of flex to do the spacing again. So we'll say flex column like that. And then we want to add a paragraph tag in for this disclaimer text. And with all that written out, then the last thing we want to do is create our button, and we're going to give it a type of submit. And I believe a button inside of a form automatically has this type, but it's never a bad thing to just, declare that anyways. And then we just want to have the text within here say pay now. So with that all saved, we now have all the markup we need. And if we toggle our preview, we can see that we're left with this pretty ugly mess. So let's start to work on the styling of this. Now, where I think we need to start if we toggle the preview is kind of getting the background color set up and also getting our form to be a fixed width. So for this, what we can do first off is there is an extension I use on Chrome called Color Picker to kind of get the background color for this. So we can just use this. And then on our div, we can just use a custom arbitrary value to set the background color for this. So we can say BG dash and then our brackets, and then we can use the pound sign and paste this in. And if we save this and toggle it off, we should now see we have that background color set. Now we'll also want to set a max width here for the form itself. And the easiest way I like to do this when I don't have actual dimensions is to take a screenshot and see the width of it in pixels. So if we do this, it's probably roughly around 400 pixels, but this may be a little bit distorted based on the image. So we can play around with that. So I think we'll start off with something of about 500 and we'll kind of, tinker around from there. So we'll say max-w and we'll use a custom arbitrary value again. And we'll just start off with 500 pixels and we can save that and take a look. So a little hard to tell right now because we don't have the background color set. So let's say BG white to do that. And if we kind of toggle between, it's kind of hard to tell, but I think maybe we'll just stick from there and we'll, add some padding to it and we'll see how everything turns out. We can always come back and adjust this value. Now for the padding on this form, we can again use the screenshot technique. So we can enable that and then we can see that this is probably about 50 pixels, give or take, on the top and bottom. And then on the left and right, it looks like it may be about 30, we'll say 32. And I can't remember correctly what the tailwind incrementations are for padding. So let me check that out really quick. And for as much as I use Tailwind, I still have a hard time remembering what exactly the actual classes relate to in terms of pixels, but it looks like we can use the P-12 for our top and bottom, and then for the left and right, we can probably use P9. So let's head back over, and then what we want to do is we'll say PY12, and then we'll say PX, and we'll set that to 9. And I think that looks good for now. We'll just leave it at that. We can always come back and mess with those values later. But also we want to round the corners here, as you can see. And we can also probably provide a shadow to make this pop a little bit more. So we'll do a class of rounded LG and then this a shadow class. And I think that's looking pretty good. So let's toggle back our preview. And let's start with our headers. So for this H1, we probably want to increase the font size. We'll maybe start off by saying XL. Oops, we got to add a class attribute first, and we'll say text-XL. And then what we want to do is, you can see we have a couple ways we could address this. We could do a line break, or we could probably just give the H1 a max width. So maybe we'll say max width, and we'll start off by maybe doing 250 pixels, maybe way too small. Let's check it out. I think that actually, yeah, I think that works. I think the text, that's probably a decent size. And then what we want to do is, where did that go? Oh, it's right here. I think we want to say, because we want this to be in the center, and I don't think we want to push everything into the center, right? I don't know if that's something we want to do. So we may just have to, I think we have a couple ways we could say, I think MX auto will push that into the center for us. And we also want to do text center as well to get the text lined up into the center. And it also does appear that this font is bold, so we'll say font dash bold, and we can save that and take a look. And actually, I think let's try making this large. I think that might be a little bit too big, and let's check it out. I think actually large is going to be the way to go for that font size. I think extra large is a little bit too big. So let's backtrack here a little bit really quickly. So one thing I forgot about is setting up our spacing. So as you can recall, we have on our form, we have a class set to flex to make this a flex container, and then we have the flex direction set to be a column. So this allows us to easily control the space between each one of the flex children, and to do this we can use a property called gap. And to actually see what that spacing is, we can use our screenshot technique again. And this looks to be about, we'll say 40 pixels. And I think if 9 was 36, I believe this goes in increments of 4 pixels, so we can use dash 10. So let's say right after column, we'll say gap dash 10. And if we save that and we take a look, I believe that's probably pretty accurate. Again, we can always mess with it later, but I think we'll just stick with that. Okay, so next we'll work on these radio inputs, which are going to control the type of billing. So for this, we have this on line 18, so let's uncollapse that. So first off, we're going to want to add a border to this, and let's go ahead and grab the color. Actually, not that. We need our color picker and see if we can see what color this is. So we'll just snag that here, and then we'll escape out of this. And then on each one of these divs, we'll just say, I believe it's border, and then border dash. I think you can just provide the color like this, and I think that works. Let's check that out to make sure. And it does. Okay, good. So let's just copy this for both of them. And for this text content, I believe right now it's currently sitting in a row. We're going to want to make this into a flex column. So we'll say flex col for both of these. And then what we also want to do is right now these aren't taking up the full space available to them. So I think we can actually achieve this by using a class of flex1 on both of these, and that'll make it take up equal shares of the flex container, which it does, which that looks a lot better. And we'll have to adjust the font size for this. So we'll apply a class. We'll probably say this one will be text small, and this also should be bolded. And then this one, I think we can just get away with text extra small like that. And I think that looks pretty good. So let's copy this down for both of them. And we'll definitely need to add some padding for these as well. So let's kind of again check out and see what that would be. So it looks like maybe we'll say 16 on the top and bottom, and it may be the same on the left and right. So we'll say padding 16 around all sides. So I believe if we take a look, that probably is padding 4. Let's see, yeah, 4. So back on this div, we'll just do p-4 for around all the sides, and we'll check and see how that looks. Hopefully, yeah, I think that's looking pretty good. And then we also want to round the corners, so we'll probably do on this one rounded, we'll say maybe medium, and see how that looks. And I think that looks pretty accurate. We still need to add some spacing between this text content, which should go ahead and increase the height a little bit. I think right now they're still a little bit small, but when we add some space between there, I think that should go ahead and fix it. The inputs need to be increased in size a little bit, and we also want to add some space in between these elements. So let's do that first. So on this div with the class of flex, we can add a gap property. So I'm just going to guess and maybe say 3 and kind of see how that looks. I think that's pretty accurate. And then on this div with our text content, we could add another gap class. Now we probably could just add a margin bottom on here and not have to worry about that, but we'll just keep it consistent and use gap across this component. So let's just start out by saying maybe gap 2. That's definitely way too big. We'll try gap 1. I think that's probably a little bit better. And then let's do the same thing. Let's add it to this one right here. And we'll also want to add some space in between this text content and the radio input itself. So what we want to do is on this div, we'll want to add a gap property. So let's just try gap 1, see how that looks, and kind of compare the two. I think maybe gap 2 might be a little better. Actually, that's the wrong one. Let's try it again, say gap 2, and let's kind of, yeah, I think gap 2 should probably work better. So let's do the same thing on this one. We'll just say gap 2 as well. Now we'll also need to make this radio input larger. So we take a look at the comp, as you can see, it's quite a bit bigger. So to actually increase the size of this, I think we can just use a width class on the radio input itself. So let's try this out, and maybe we'll say width, and we'll just do maybe 20 pixels for now. And I think that's actually a good a good size. We'll maybe go with 20. Now, the one issue that we have is it looks like it's currently being centered into the middle of this entire div, and we're not actually setting anything like that. So I'm not quite sure if that's the default behavior, is to push it into the middle, and we'll update this input as well. So I wonder if we were to try, let's do like self start, and that should align everything to the very start, and that doesn't seem to do anything itself. So I wonder if we were to apply self start to the input itself, if that would actually fix it. So let's try this out. So we'll say self start like that, and that does seem to push it to the beginning, but now the input's back to the original size. So I wonder if we also have to define a actual height as well. And okay, I think that's exactly what we need to do. So let's copy the height and then the self start, and then we'll also apply it to the second input as well. Now these radio inputs are looking pretty good. I think what we want to do next is this little tag that we have within the yearly input. So for this, I think we can do either a few different options. We could set the paragraph to be display flex and add some gap, or I think a little bit easier way to tackle this, and maybe a little bit different way, is just to add a margin on the left hand side, and maybe we'll say 2. But will that cause, we'll have to see if that's going to work or not. Then the text size we can try with extra small, and we'll just kind of see how that looks. That still looks way too big. I think that's like 12 pixels extra small, so maybe let's do 8 pixels. I think that looks pretty good. Then we'll want to set a background on here, and we're going to need to use our color picker to grab that color really quick. Actually, both colors. So let's do our color picker, and let's grab this color, which actually I think it's the same exact color we have for the background behind the card itself. So we can just actually do this within there, and let's take a look and see if that margin actually caused any problems. I don't think it did. Let's also just maybe add a shadow on here to make it pop a little bit, and then we can probably add a touch of padding to actually give us a separation on the left and right. And maybe let's just do P-1 all around and see how that looks. I think that's pretty good. Now, the one thing it does seem to look a little odd is that they're not really centered, or they don't appear to be. So actually, maybe the margin left approach isn't going to work. What we probably could do is set this to be flex like that, and maybe say items center. And then I think that's okay, but I believe we won't need this padding around it. Or maybe just on the left and right, we'll do PX1, and then we can add a gap of 2. And I think that's a much better approach to getting that. Let's take a look at that. And then we'll just want to get that color for the text itself. So let's use our color picker once more and see if we can select that color. There it is. And then within the span, we'll just go right beside text, and we'll say text, use an arbitrary value, and then paste that in. And let's check that out. And I think that is actually looking pretty good. Now, there is an active state for whichever option you choose, whether it be monthly or yearly. And if we have some time, we might come back and actually add some JavaScript to this, where if you click on monthly or yearly, it'll toggle the active state back and forth, but we'll see. So for right now, we're just going to add the active state to the yearly one. So for this, we're first going to want to grab that color of the border. So let's see if we can grab that. I think it's really small to see, so it's kind of hard to get. So I think the border color and this input are the same color. So I think for the border, we're just going to use this input color value, or the selected circle color. So let's copy this. And then what we want to do is for the border on the yearly, we'll just change the color to be this. And if we save that, then that should now be the active state. Now, in regards to having the actual input checked, I think for radios, if I'm not mistaken, we can just do, I think, like checked, and that'll automatically have it checked. But the problem is, I think, based on how radios work, if I understand them correctly, is if we click on monthly, then that's going to also be enabled. We want to basically be able to click and have one be actually selected or the other, and right now that's not how it works. So I think for that, we have to assign these names, I think, or it could be IDs. We'll have to see if this works. So let's just do maybe give this a name of billing, and then let's also apply a name of billing here and see if that works. So we'll save that. And if we select this one, now they change. So yeah, when you're using radios, you have to give them a name attribute, or if you're using, I guess, them in this scenario where we have, one that we want to toggle back and forth, you have to give them the same name. So now when we select back and forth, the monthly is going to be deactivated and yearly will be, and vice versa. So I think that's going to do it for the second section. Like I mentioned, the only thing we may come back and do if we have enough time is add some JavaScript to actually transition the active state to whichever one that you select. But for right now, it's just hard-coded as the yearly. And one thing we actually forgot to add was the shadow. So let's try adding a shadow here. Maybe even do shadow medium, make it pop a little bit more. And I think I like that. I think that's good. Okay. And then also what we probably could do with some JavaScript is if we select monthly or yearly, then the total build value will also update as well. It'll either be 7 or it can be 50, but depending on whichever option you choose. So let's begin to work on the final section here. So let's collapse this div to save some space, and then we'll just collapse this and open up this, which has our text heading. So for this H2, we're going to apply the same class we gave our H1, so we'll just say text large, because if we take a look at the comp, I believe they kind of look the same size. So we also want to give this, change the font weight to bold, so we'll do font bold like that. And then I think, let's take a look at the comp, we probably want to make that text a little bit smaller, so we'll just say class text SM like this. And then we just want to apply some spacing. So as I mentioned, we really don't need to apply flex and flex col. We could just apply some margin on the bottom. So actually, I don't really think it's necessary for this one. So let's just remove that. And then we can just apply a margin on the bottom. We'll just take a look. So we'll probably say that's margin bottom. We'll say like maybe 8 pixels. So we'll just say margin bottom 2. And I think that looks pretty good. So what we can do next is add the spacing between each one of our flex children inside of this flex container, and we can do that with a gap class. So let's first see what the gap is between these. So let's just use our screenshot technique, and we'll probably say about 32 pixels. Let's check the bottom, want to make sure they're the same or roughly the same. And it doesn't have to be perfect. So yeah, they look like they're about 32 pixels of space between, so we can just use the gap8 class, which should be 32 pixels. And if we save that, yeah, we can see we now have those spaced out, and I think that's pretty good. Obviously, it doesn't look quite as accurate yet because we still have to style out these inputs and the button. So for this card number input, as you can see, the label and the input are side by side, and I think the reason for that is because a label by default is an inline block element. So we could do a couple things to fix this. We could either set this div to be display flex and set a direction of flex column, or I think the easiest solution is just to assign this label to be a block element, and that should push the input to the next line. Now also for the labels, we're going to need to adjust the font size, as it is quite a bit smaller in the design than the default font size we have of 16. So let's just do text SM like that and see how that looks. And then, yeah, I think that's pretty good. And then also what we're going to want to do is this is going to be bold. So we'll say font bold. And let's even try out extra small and see how that looks. And yeah, it does appear that that is actually the correct font size. So we'll just go with extra small. So what we can do is then just apply all of these classes to our labels. So let's do that. So for the inputs themselves, let's start off by getting the correct padding. So let's use our screenshot technique, and it looks like it's about 16 on the top and bottom. And then let's see, it looks like I'm going to assume 16 on the left and right hand side. So on the input, let's add a new class, and we'll just do p-4. And we'll also want to add a border to our inputs. So we'll say border, and then for the border color, it appears that the border color is the same as the ones we have for these radio inputs. So let's just grab that border color, and it is on this div right here, and then we can just add this to our input. So there we go, we have our border added. We're also going to want to round the corner, so we'll say rounded medium, and then we also want the input to take the full space available inside of this form. So to do that, we can just say W full for a width of 100%, and that should span it across the entire form. And since these inputs are the exact same, we can just copy these classes and we can apply them to the other two inputs that we have. And we'll also need to add some spacing between these elements and also these two inputs within this row. So for that, we can just use a gap class on this div. So we'll start off with maybe saying gap2, and definitely needs to be a little bit bigger. So let's try gap4, which is about 16 pixels. And I think, oops, let's actually add that back. And I think that looks pretty accurate. Then for these two inputs, we can add another gap class on here. So maybe we'll just say gap4 as well. So the one issue we have with this is they aren't taking up the full space available inside of that flex container. So for this, we can use a class called flex1, and then we can say flex1, and then those should span the full width of the form now, and they'll take up equal amounts of space. Now we're also going to need to add some space between our labels and the inputs. So on the label, let's just start off by saying margin bottom 1 and seeing how that looks. I think that's good. It just adds a little separation from the input and the label itself. So let's apply this to all of our labels. And to keep things simple for this component, I don't think we actually need to have this expiration date input have the type of date. I think we can just get by with having it be a type of text. Now these inputs also have the same focus or active state as the radio input ones we did earlier. So what we want to do is let's go back over to those radio inputs and let's grab that border color that we assigned. And I think what we can do for this is target the input in a focus state by saying focus colon, and then we can paste in that border color, and if we now focus into it, we're still going to see that outline. So I think what we can also do is target in a focus again, and then we can just say outline none, I think. And if we save that, we now have that correct border color when we are focusing into the input. So let's just copy this and then paste it onto the other inputs as well. And what we can probably even do is when we focus, we can also add a shadow just to make it pop a little bit more. So we'll say focus and we'll do shadow. So now when we focus in, we have that little nice shadow. And then again, let's just add this to all of our inputs. All right, so the last bit of styling we need to do is going to be this disclaimer text and then this button. So let's start off by making this text quite a bit smaller because right now it is at the default font size of 16. So I think we might even have to do a custom size because I think extra small is probably not going to be small enough. So let's try maybe 10 pixels like that. And then we're also going to want to align all this text to the center. So we can say text center like that. And I think that looks pretty accurate or as close as we're going to get it. Now, the next thing we want to do is add some spacing between the paragraph and the button itself. And we did have a class of flex and flex column set up on here so we could use the gap property. But again, since we're really only using 2 elements inside of this div, I really don't see the reason to set this as a flex container. So instead, what we can do is just apply a margin on the bottom of this paragraph. So we'll just do margin bottom probably 4, which is 16 pixels. And we'll see how that works. And once we apply, the padding and the background color to the button, we may adjust that a little bit. It's hard to tell right now. Now, since we removed the actual display of flex from this div, the button is no longer taking up the full width available. So what we want to do is we'll want to apply a class, and then we'll say width full for the width to be 100%, and that should make it span the full width again. Now the background color for this button appears to be the same as our active states that we have for the input, so we can just copy that from our code we have already. But let's also grab the padding for this button on the top and bottom. So if we look, it appears to probably be around 32, we'll say, on the top and bottom. So that'll be the PY class, and then we want to say, I think that's going to be 8. And then let's grab that background color, which should be within this, and then we have it as our border. So let's just grab this color code. And then we can just create a custom background color by saying BG and then using an arbitrary value and then just pasting in that color code. So if we save that and then we toggle the preview, we should now see we have our button, which I think looks pretty accurate. However, we just need to update the font color to be white. So we'll just do text white, and we'll also want to round the corner. So we'll say rounded medium, and I think that looks pretty accurate. So I do think we actually need to adjust the margin between our disclaimer and our button. So instead of saying margin bottom 4, we'll try margin bottom 6, and I think that looks a lot better. Now the design that we have doesn't actually have a hover effect for the button, but it's usually a pretty good idea to add one of these. So for hover effect on a button, you could do things like an opacity, you can make it scale, you could add a box shadow. So there's a lot of things you can do to add a little effect to buttons. So in our scenario, what we can probably do is just say hover. Maybe we can do an opacity on the button. So we'll say opacity -80 like that. So now when we hover over it, the button's going to have an opacity. And if we wanted to smooth it out a little bit, we could use a duration class, and we'll say maybe 150 to add a transition to this. So now when you hover over it, that transition is going to be less abrupt and it's going to be a lot smoother. Okay, so I think we got this styled out pretty close. If we take a look, we can see that it looks fairly accurate. It's not going to be pixel perfect, but it's pretty close. So we do have some extra time. So I think what we can do is add some JavaScript for a few things. So whenever we toggle from monthly to yearly, we want the actual active or selected state to change to whatever one we have selected. And based on the selection that you make, we'll want to update the total build portion here to reflect that selection. And then also we can do a little bit of form submission handling for when you hit pay now, we can just alert you that you have submitted the form. So what I think we need to do for this in order to transfer the active state to whichever radio input we select is I think we'll need to listen for what is called the input event on each one of these radio inputs. And once we hear that input event, we're going to need to check and see if that input has been checked. If it has, then we need to gain access to this div, which is where we add our active state to, and change the border color, which we have hard-coded to the yearly one, which is right here. And we'll also need to add our shadow, and if it's not checked, then we want to add our default border and then remove that shadow. So within our JavaScript file, the first thing we want to do is gain access to our radio inputs. So we'll create a new variable and we'll just call this radio inputs, and then we'll set this equal to a document.querySelectorAll because we want to gain access to all of these. And then within here, we're going to gain access to our input, but we want to gain access to the specific input that has a type of radio. So I think we can just say type is then equal to radio. And just to make sure this is working, let's log out to the console, the radio inputs. So let's open up the console and let's see if we have that being logged out, and we do. So if we expand this, we can see we have our two radio inputs that we now have access to. So let's remove this console.log, and what we want to do is we want to loop over this array of our inputs, and for each input that we have, we want to listen for the input event on each one of those inputs. So to do this, we can just reference the radio inputs array. We can use a method called for each to loop over each one of these, and then we can give it a param. So we'll just call this radio input, and then this accepts a callback. And within this callback, we can reference our param of radio input, which is going to be this input or this one or both of them. And then what we can do is we can then add a event listener, and we want to listen for the input event, and then this also accepts a callback. And for right now, let's just do a console.log of the radio input itself. And if we did things correctly, once we select on monthly, we should then be able to see that we're getting logged out to the console, the current input that we selected. However, I did think that once you listen for the input event, since it's going to change, it would list out both of them, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So that's going to make it a little bit more tricky to try to strip away the current active state on the radio input that was deselected. So I'm going to have to think about how we would do that. Okay, so I think I found a way that we can handle it using this method. Now, this may be way overcomplicated and there may be a way better way of doing this, but on the fly, this is what I'm thinking of. So what we want to do is we need to gain reference to the current selected radio input. So I think we can do this by saying, or creating a new variable. And then we'll set this equal to a new document.querySelector. And then I think we can do something very similar to what we did here, except on the very end we can append checked, I believe, and then I think we can make sure this is working. Let's just do a console.log and we'll do selected radio input. Okay, so as you can see, now we're able to gain reference to the currently checked input, which is great. However, we really don't care about the input itself. We care about the parent div that is wrapping it. So I think to gain access to that, we can just append on this. We can say parent element. And then if we save that, we can now gain access to that entire div, which is where we have the active state. So the idea behind how this is going to work is that each time we hear the input event, we're going to then target the selected radio input, and we want to remove this border class, and we want to replace it with the default border. And then we want to then reassign the selected radio input to the current input that actually was selected. So because we want to do that, this will also have to change from a constant. We'll have to declare it as a let, so that way we can reassign it. So what we should be able to do is reference our selected radio input, and then we want to use the property of class list, and then there's a method called remove, and then the class that we want to remove is going to be this border right here. Alright, so with this added, once we select a different input, then the current active one should be stripped, and as you can see, once we do that, that border is going to be removed. So what we'll also need to do, since we're removing that border color, is we're going to have to add the default border color back. So instead of using the remove method, we can use the add, and then we want to head back over to the HTML and grab that default border. Then what we're going to want to do is we want to reference our selected radio input again, and then we want to set this equal to the current radio input that has been selected, and then the parent element. Then what we can do is just copy these two classes here, we can paste them down, and then what we can do is save that. And then instead of saying remove, we want to add this border, and then instead of adding, we want to remove this one. And if we did everything correctly, if we select on monthly, it's going to change the active state over to monthly, and if we select on yearly, it's going to change it back to yearly. Now, this probably isn't the best way to do it, but like I mentioned on the fly, this is what I thought of, and I'm pretty sure that someone will have a better way of handling this and a little bit cleaner, because this is a little bit confusing how we're removing a class list from the radio input, then we're reassigning it, and then we're adding it back. But like I mentioned, we're doing this on the fly, and that was the best that I could think of. So let's just remove these two console.log statements, as we're not going to need these. Now, to update this value depending on the monthly or yearly option you choose, we should be able to use this radio inputs.forEach logic and tap into whichever radio input that we have selected and then update this value accordingly. So for this, what I think we need to do is we want to first reference the H2. Now, we don't really need to worry about updating this entire thing. We just want to update the actual value of 50 or 7. So what we probably need to do is we'll create a span. And then let's see if I can actually type. Now to reference this span, what we want to do is by default, we can just put within this 50 because that's what the starting value is at. And to reference this value inside of our JavaScript, we can just give it a class, and then we can set this equal to total build like this. And if we save that, everything should still work as expected. Then inside of our JavaScript file, we just want to create a new variable. And we'll set this equal to a document.querySelector, and then the value that we want to reference is called total build like this. And then within this for each loop, what we want to do is we then want to actually, if we look back at the radio inputs themselves, I don't believe they have a value associated to them. So what we want to do is we can apply a value to this. So this one will be 7. And then for the yearly one, we can just apply a value and set this equal to 50. So we save that, head back over to our JavaScript file. Then what we can do is we can say the total build.innerHTML is going to be equal to the radio input. And I think we can just say value like that. I'm not 100% sure if that's going to work. So let's switch this up, and it does. So as you can see, when we select on monthly, it's going to be changed to 7, and if we go back to yearly, it'll change back to 50. Alright, so the last little piece of logic that we can do is actually submit our form. Now we're not going to submit any data, but I just want to show you how we can, create a fake submission. So let's actually put a few semicolons here because we're missing those. So first off, we're going to want to reference our form. So we'll just say form, and we'll set this equal to a document.querySelector, and then the element that we want to reference or gain access to is going to be our form. Now, obviously, if you have more than one form on the page, you may want to use a class to do this, but since we only have one within this component, we're just going to reference this by using the form tag with the document.querySelector. So with our form variable, what we want to do is we can just go beneath our radio inputs and we can reference the form variable, and we can add a event listener onto here. And all we want to listen for is going to be the submit event. And then we're also going to pass in a callback for this event listener, and we'll just pass along the actual event parameter. And then what we want to do is we want to say e.preventDefault to prevent the default action from happening when you submit a form, which will be to refresh the page. And then what we can do for now is just say alert, and then you submitted the form like this. So if we save that and we click on the pay now, we should be able to get a message that says you submitted the form, which is great. Now, one thing we could do to improve this is if you wanted to have all the inputs be required, what you could do is go to each one of these inputs that we have created, and then you could add the required attribute on here. So that way, when you submit the form, all these have to have a value. And now if we attempt to fill out the form with these required attributes added to the inputs, we're then going to get a message saying please fill out this field before you can submit it. Alright, so I think that's going to wrap it up here for this challenge. Now, once you have finished, what you want to do is you want to click on the publish button in the top right hand corner. And this is going to prompt you with a modal congratulating you on finishing the challenge, and it's also going to have a variety of different share options, so that way you can go ahead and share your solution on social media. Now, once you do that, you can either view more challenges or go to your profile. And from your profile, if you do want to make any changes to your solution at any time, you can just select on the challenge itself. And you can first off view your solution like this, or if you want to make any changes to it, you can just click on the edit button in the top right hand corner, and then you'll be able to make changes to your solution. Alright, so that's going to wrap it up for this challenge here on Web Dev Daily. If you did enjoy it and you want to see more challenge solutions like this on the channel, be sure to let me know by leaving a like on this video. Also, if you are using the platform and you want to provide any feedback, you can do so by leaving a comment down below in this video, or if you want, we have an official Web Dev Daily Discord, and I'll leave a link to join down below in the description. But anyways, thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.